Well, after months of discussion, deliberation, and conflict over who will play who and who will make it into the 2022 NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, Christmas time for hockey fans has finally arrived. Welcome to the J&J Podcast, where we discuss all things hockey from around the world. I'm Jackson Starr, joined alongside Jake Titus, and today we will discuss the first round of the NHL playoffs, some other news going on around the NHL, and from the playoffs, matchups, players, storylines, and everything else when it comes to the final 16 teams remaining in competition for hockey's greatest prize. But as mentioned, first, we got to talk about a couple big topics going on around the NHL over the past couple of days. And Jake, if you want to join in, Carey Price potentially retiring. Big press conference that the Habs had the other day, major media availabilities. Kent Hughes kind of spoke about Price's uncertainty. Price obviously spoke about how he doesn't feel like he could play a full season. Just a lot of stuff to talk about with Price, obviously, at the end of the season.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's very tough because you look at Carey Price and what Carey Price's legacy in Montreal is. I mean, this guy is a fantastic goaltender, has been for over a decade. I mean, yes, he's slowed down in the last couple of years, but as all goalies are when they get to a certain age, they do start to slow down and they do tend to see a decrease in production. But when you look at it kind of from a realistic point of view, is this surprising? I mean, this is a goaltender who's battled some demons. He's battled some injuries. He's battled, some addictions. Um, and just as he was starting to get healthy this season, it comes out that he has this knee injury. And honestly, if I was in his position, even though he is such a fantastic goaltender, I'm kind of not shocked that he would be reconsidering his thoughts at playing in the NHL next year. It's sad to say, but even though he's such a well respected and fantastic goaltender, I'm just if I was in those shoes, I don't know if I'd be able to continue.
Yeah, and I think a massive kind of discussion point about it was what Price said in the interview. I mean, I watched the interview, and he was kind of saying how what he needs his knee to do in order to be an NHL goaltender, he's not really capable of doing that on a season long level. He can't really continue that for a full season, which is concerning. And that's kind of a gray area. Kent Hughes kind of said this as well the other day. It's kind of a gray area for the Habs because if they don't have Price, it's going to be Allen, maybe Montembeault. If they do have Price, where does Montembeault slot in? So without the certainty of Price kind of being there or not being there, it leaves a lot of stuff goaltending wise up in the air for the Habs, and it adds an interesting caveat to their offseason for sure in my mind.
And not even considering that, like, even if Carey Price says, okay, well, if I can't do this for a full season, maybe he could come back in a limited role, like as a backup goaltender. He'd be a fantastic backup goaltender. It would be less hard on the body. But do you really trust Jake Allen to be a 50 to 60 game guy? I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen how he was in St. Louis. He plays his best hockey on limited minutes, max 40 games a season. After that, he starts to struggle. He starts to show inconsistency issues, and he starts to struggle with the spotlight. It's one of the main reasons why the St. Louis Blues a couple of years ago, right before Bennington got the call up, and they ended up winning the cup. It's one of the main reasons why the team wasn't doing well. It was Mike Yeo and his interesting coaching style, and it was also this lack of being able to fill in the spotlight of a starting goaltender that Jake Allen has. So even if Carey Price decides to come back next season in a limited role instead of the full blown starter role, I mean, are the Habs like ready for that? Like, are they able to support him and is Jake Allen able to support the team in such a larger role, I guess?
Yeah, I think I mean something that comes to mind right away is Price is the type of guy. I mean, look at the trend of Montreal Canadiens goaltenders, and I mean you've got Ken Dryden, Patrick Roy, Carey Price. Those are the last three big ones, that have led this team for a considerably long amount of time. Although Dryden wasn't there for a necessarily long time, the success speaks for itself. So
Mhm.
filling in for Roy, they trade Roy, they bring in Jocelyn Thibault, and he was good, Jocelyn Thibault, but he never lived up to the hype that he was supposed to because he had to fill the shoes of Patrick Roy. No matter who you bring in to replace a guy like Carey Price, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to fill those shoes. And that could take a long time, even if you're a guy like Caden Primo in the minor leagues, or the Habs have a good amount of goaltending depth in the minors in their prospect system as well. does anyone have the capability to fill the shoes that Carey Price kind of leaves if he does leave? I don't know. I don't think so. So,
And you even consider, like, you mentioned Jocelyn Thibault. Right after that, they brought in Jose Theodore. Jose Theodore, fantastic goalie. He won the Hart Trophy. I mean, his play, like, you couldn't debate how good he was. But even him, he couldn't live up to the expectations, and he got ran out of Montreal a couple years later. Like,
yes.
is Caden Primo really at that point in his career? I don't think so. Some people some very, very optimistic fans may disagree, but I just don't see it. And, as much as I like guys like Joe Verbetich, who just eliminated my hometown 67s in the OHL playoffs, and as much as I like, oh God, what's the other prospect? Jakob Dobes?
Dobes, excuse me.
Yeah, Jakob Dobes. As much as I like him in the NCAA, are these guys the kind of guys that could take the reins and hit the ground running? I'm not too sure.
No, I'd agree 100%. Well, I think it's time we move on to another interesting situation going on around the NHL from a team out of the playoffs, and that's Detroit. Just completely,
The Iser plan.
exactly, purging their front office. Blashill gone, assistants gone, just, him coming out and saying they've all kind of come to terms and agreed to move on. So just an interesting situation going on in Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes as no surprise, but it also comes as surprising because you would have thought that if they were going to, purge their front office, they would have done it earlier. But, especially after the kind of season that guys like Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider had. I mean, these guys had fantastic seasons, and as much as you could say, well, Moritz Seider, he trained with Nick Lidstrom over in Sweden, and he trained a little bit with Nicholas Kronwall as well. How much of that was also the fact that they, coaching? And we don't know that. I mean, obviously, Jeff Blashill's been in the organization for 7 years. He's been there longer than a lot of guys who are currently on the team. Like, even Dylan Larkin hasn't been there as long as Jeff Blashill has. So it's going to be very interesting to see how a lot of the, I guess, long-timers of the Detroit Red Wings are able to fit into a new system and who that potential coach could be.
Yeah, that's a big question mark. I'm curious to think, as you were talking, just thinking, who is going to be the guy to fill that role? I mean, are you going to bring a guy in from the minor leagues? There are a couple good coaches out there who have worked their way in the past. In the past, I mean, so it's going to be an interesting discussion to see. Obviously, a team that's kind of on the rise in Detroit, very young squad. It's going to be interesting to see who they kind of choose to fill in that role, bring these young players along, and for Detroit fans, hopefully get themselves back into a playoff spot in the coming years. So
I agree.
So another conversation, obviously very important to you, Jake, in Ottawa.
Yep.
The Sens, they had some postseason press conferences, and they said a lot of interesting things, especially Pierre Dorion.
Yeah, Pierre Dorion was the main person at the press conference. It was held at 10 a.m. this morning on the 1st. And it really concerns me as a Sens fan because I'm not too sure if he's the guy who should be leading this team in the future. With the way that, the team has kind of been built, I mean, there's a lot of pieces that you cannot thank Dorion enough for. But there's also been moves where it makes you reconsider, his position as a general manager, as a fan. And whenever you get a look at the psyche and the mind of a general manager, like whether it's with Kent Hughes in Montreal and how refreshing it is to hear him talk about the team, whenever I hear Pierre Dorion talk, I'm just left more confused because I struggle to figure out what direction this team is going in. Because, I mean, Eugene Melnick said a couple of years ago that this team would be spending up to the cap by 2021. It's 2022 now. We're going into the 2022-2023 season, and there's no sign of that. As Pierre Dorion has said, unless they sell out every game, they won't be spending to the cap. And I get it. Incremental spending is important. You can't just throw all your money at guys in free agency and expect returns immediately. That didn't work for the Minnesota Wild in the early 2010s. It didn't work for many other teams. But being this anxious to spend money, how many years into a rebuild? 5, 6 years into a rebuild. I'm really concerned about it. He did point out some good things. He thought Anton Forsberg was our MVP this season, which I would have to agree with. I think him stepping up from a third-string goaltender with the help of Zach Bjork, the goalie coach, and becoming a literal top 10 goaltender in terms of analytics in the league, whether or not that's true when it comes to his actual ability, it's impressive. It's fantastic. I'm very, very impressed with Anton Forsberg this season. But it's just, you know, you can't just let go of guys like Tyler Ennis. Like
Yeah.
Tyler Ennis, and they mentioned that Tyler Ennis, Chris Tierney, and Victor Mete will not be returning. Ennis, they did leave the door open. They just said that he was going to test unqualified free agency. If they wanted to bring him back, they might, if the opportunity presented itself. But I like Victor Mete. He was fine. He was inconsistent. Offensively, he was all right. Defensively, he was pretty solid. But he was inconsistent. And, he's still young. You know a lot about Victor Mete, being a Montreal Canadiens fan, and you know how he kind of went through the system. But
Yep.
I thought he was all right in Ottawa. How was he in Montreal?
Yeah, look, in Montreal, the thing about Montreal, especially with guys like Mete, is when you're under a system that Bergevin and Julien kind of had, it's difficult for a young defenseman to be able to flourish. We saw a couple of instances with Julien, and especially with Ducharme. I mean, he sheltered. An example from the forward standpoint is Cole Caulfield. I mean, it's a different player in the second half of the season under Marty St. Louis. But from Mete's perspective, I think that when he went to Ottawa, he showed that he had more upside with regard to carrying the puck up the ice, moving the puck through the neutral zone, and being able to be a distributor. Obviously, he basically has no shot. I mean, he can shoot the puck if it finds him and he gets a lucky bounce and it finds the back of the net, but he's not necessarily a guy who you're going to set up for a one-timer on a power play. And, in the defensive zone, he's not bad. He's obviously, his size isn't necessarily great, but I think his speed helps him out a lot in today's game. And, I was upset when the Habs lost him because, he's a young defenseman who has upside, and from the Sens' perspective, I don't think letting him go is the smart move. I think he's a guy who can develop with this young core, and play a bottom four pairing on a good team or on a solid playoff team, I'd say, and a guy who has a capability at making something happen in the NHL, and something that I think the Sens will regret. I'm surprised about Tyler Ennis, to be honest. Like I think that he's
Spark
a veteran
plug.
player. He's a veteran player. He's a good player to help the young core again coming along. He's a great forward to kind of bring that energy. I mean, when you watch him play, he's one of the guys who's out there going into the corners, working hard, even though he's a smaller guy. I think that when I went to see the Sens this season, he was one of those guys that was almost a spark plug who would be able to carry a team when not a lot of the guys were necessarily showing a lot of oomph when they were down. So I don't know. I think that that's a mistake, letting him go. Obviously, like you said, it's kind of an open-ended thing where he is going to test the market and see, and he could come back, which is good. Chris Tierney, I mean, from speaking with Sens fans, Tierney is really not necessarily a guy that they want around anymore. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what the deal is with that. I think you can speak more to that, Jake, if you want, on Tierney.
To put it very, very, very bluntly, he skates like he doesn't want to play hockey. He's had a very, very good passing game. Like his playmaking ability when he first came to Ottawa, it was very good. He was like a 40 assist player, 50 points. You cannot complain about that era of Chris Tierney. But ever since kind of like the pandemic has happened, he's really slowed down. His kind of foot speed and his quickness, his agility, all of it's kind of regressed. And defensively, he's made some errors in judgment, although he has been solid. But offensively, it's almost like his offensive instincts have all but disappeared. But I do have one more question about the press conference, because I think this is a very, very important point, right? So if you have a prospect, right, and this is a prospect who has yet to play an NHL game, yet to play a professional hockey game, right?
Yes.
Puts up very good stats in juniors or NCAA or over in Europe. What do you want to do, or what shouldn't you do to kind of raise the pressure, right? What is the one thing where if you are a coach or a general manager and you are asked a question about said prospect to kind of limit the pressure on that player to succeed, what would you not do?
Well, I mean, I think I would not think you put added pressure on him by. Phew, it's a good question. I just don't bring more attention to him. Let him kind of work his way through the system as he needs to. I don't know. That's what I would say. Maybe
Well,
I'm
I'm
wrong.
going to give you a quote by Pierre Dorian. And he said this morning, "We want to be careful with our expectations about Jake Sanderson." All right, fantastic.
Yes.
But wait, there's more. But we drafted Carlson and Shabbat, and he is in that category. Comparing him to Shabbat isn't the worst thing, even though Shabbat's a fantastic defenseman, and arguably I think he's been a top 21 this season. Um, but comparing him to Carlson, who at one point was looked at least in the realm of guys like McDavid, Crosby, like the top 5, top 10 guys in the league, barring position,
Hmm.
that is not what you do to a prospect who has all this upside. Because, I mean, what if he crumbles? Like, you're adding so much pressure saying, okay, this is the best defenseman we've ever had, and you're in that category.
Yeah. No. I agree. I don't think that's necessary from a general manager in any organization to say he's a comparable to these types of guys. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Dorian, maybe his words were wrong, and he's saying, "Look, we drafted them high. He could potentially be that." And maybe not trying to put expectations on the shoulders of the kid, but at the same time it definitely comes off that way, and that's really important, especially from a GM in Dorian who has said some questionable things in the past. When
For a
something like
team.
that comes out, exactly, when when something comes out like that and a player hears that, it's and you don't, I guess, live up to that hype. It's alarming. So I think that it's something that uh, Dorian that the Senators don't want. I think Sanderson will be a very good player. I think he could live up to the hype, but at the same time, you're putting expectations on a kid that's very unnecessary and something that you don't necessarily want to say at a press conference, in my mind, at all.
Yep, and I'm just going to run down a couple more things that were at the press conference that maybe we don't need to get into too much, but
Perfect.
just kind of surface level. Um, Apparently, Matt Murray had a very productive exit meeting with Pierre Dorian, and the expectation is that the Sens will rock 3 goalies at the starting of the year. So I'm assuming that would indicate that it would be probably Matt Murray, uh, Philip Forsberg, and then one of either Matt Sogard or Philip Gustafson. Because I don't think, even though Gustafson's been very good at times this year, I don't think he's exactly won that role yet, especially with
Yeah.
Sogard's play in Belleville and just in a few call-ups.
Mhm.
Um, Other things that he's mentioned is that he's talked about how getting free agents isn't easy, considering that there's so much media scrutiny in a Canadian city, and some people don't like the taxes. And worst of all, of course, Ottawa not being a good team. He mentioned that Marcus Stelich is more than ready, and he would have been here for the final month to see how ready he was for next year, but they needed him in Belleville to help with the playoff run. Um,
Hmm.
so Kostelich has been fantastic. There has allegedly been a personal issue in the family of former first-round pick Tyler Boucher, who notably was in Boston College this past year, or Boston University. I always mix the two up. Didn't really have great stats and ended up signing with the 67s, who had his draft rights. And he's been all right offensively, not exactly a game changer, but in terms of his physical play and just work off the puck, he's been surprisingly really really good given the
Hmm.
lower expectations from his questionable NCAA career. But apparently, there's a personal issue in the family of Tyler Boucher, so who knows if maybe next season he'll you know maybe play up to his I guess, regular ability, but you can only hope for it. I am a bit concerned about it, though, considering that he's had issues in college, he's had issues before he was drafted with the knee injury, and then now all of a sudden there's issues with the 67s, or while he's on the 67s, not necessarily with. And then finally, the big thing about it is the amount of injuries that the Sens have had at the end of the season. So if you want to list down, like I sent you what injuries the Sens have faced. Most of these guys were playing while injured, so just keep that in mind.
So you've got Tyler Ennis, who had a shoulder injury. Murray had a concussion. Brown, both wrists were injured, one of which was broken. Brady Tkachuk, both of his hands. He also had a knee and a back injury. Shane Pinto's shoulder. Matthew Joseph's shoulder and his sternum. Colin White had COVID, and Sanderson, he had a hand injury, which he re-injured this past week and was now in a cast as the season came to an end. And Sanderson, it says, should be fine to come back for training camp, but just a lot of injuries on that list.
Yeah, and consider that I mean, everyone makes fun of the Habs for being the most injured team this past season. Ottawa's got to be up there. I mean, they missed pretty much an entire month due to COVID, and then had a condensed schedule for the rest of the year. And they were missing at least 3 to 4 guys out of their lineup on almost a nightly basis. Like, it's kind of funny that, both of us are like, you're a Habs fan, I'm a Sens fan, and we both went through the most miserable seasons in a long time. But, man, it's insane.
Look, hopefully next year for both teams, injuries, I mean, you could look at the success standpoints, and, the Sens, in my mind, can be a much better team, especially if they are healthy. And, if you go through the laundry list of injuries here, I mean, the fact that Brady Tkachuk had both hands were injured, he had a knee and a back injury, I mean, if you can see what he could do when he's healthy, if he's putting up good production when he's injured like this. So, I mean, that goes for a couple of guys as well. And, I think that both of our teams could potentially improve next season, especially if they find health throughout the season. And obviously COVID plays a big role in that. So we'll see if that goes. But are we ready to move on to the playoffs?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's go right into it. So we're going to break down each playoff series and just kind of discuss each team. Then we're going to finish off with our predictions for each one. And we're going to start in the Eastern Conference with Boston and Carolina. So for the Boston Bruins, they come into the playoffs with a record of 51-26-5 on the season, good for 107 points. Brad Marchand leads the team in points. He had 32 goals, 48 assists for 80 points on the year. David Pastrnak is second, 40-goal season for Pastrnak, 37 assists and 77 total points. Then Patrice Bergeron, 25 goals, 40 assists, 65 points on the year. Now, the wins leader for the Bruins is Linus Ullmark with 26. That's a low number in comparison to some other teams in the playoffs. We'll get to that. And in their last playoff appearance was last year, 2021, in which they defeated the Capitals in 5 games and then lost to the New York Islanders in 6 games. And just a lot of interesting storylines for the Boston Bruins coming into the season, one of which is the goaltending, Jake.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially on Boston's end, goaltending is going to be interesting. I think both teams in this series have a few goaltending issues. We'll get into Carolina's in just a moment. But, there's a real question on who's going to be the starter on Boston's side. Will it be a guy like Jeremy Swayman, who's 24 years old and has very, very little playoff experience in general? He hasn't had any playoff experience in the NCAA or the AHL, and he played 1 game in the playoffs and had a .667 save percentage. Or will it be Linus Ullmark, who has had no playoff experience in the NHL and hasn't played in the playoffs since 2014-15? He has played in the playoffs since, but he's only played well in the playoffs since 2014-15. And he had a 4.24 goals against average in the SHL playoffs. So there's real concern on who's going to be the goaltender for the playoffs for the Bruins. And, I mean, especially when you consider that this is a team that has a lot of guys who are older and have that playoff experience from the Cup run in the early 2010s. And then you also have a lot of guys that are younger in the depth. Having good goaltending is very important for a deep playoff run, and we're going to really see if the Boston Bruins have that goaltender. And
Yeah.
that's not the only goaltending issue that the Boston Bruins will run into, because you have to talk about the matchup. Well, okay, what if Swayman does face off against a guy like Frederik Andersen? Well, Frederik Andersen has way more playoff experience than the both of them. I mean, Freddie Andersen,
Sure.
who was in Toronto, and you could mention the jokes about him losing to Boston in the first round, but at least he's had that playoff experience at an NHL level, and Frederik Andersen has also had that more playoff experience than Ullmark. Uh, and even when you go back to the backup goaltender, Antti Ranta, again, way more playoff experience. I'm pretty sure he won a cup in Chicago. So,
Yeah.
like, it's going to be tough for Boston with that regard. But there are a few other notable things about Boston.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you highlighted this a couple days ago, Jake, that Mark McLaughlin is going to be kind of an outlier in this series.
Mhm.
If he's not used as a black ace, kind of off the roster, then he's going to be an interesting depth scorer for the team in the playoffs. And if you want to elaborate on that, you definitely can. Obviously, Boston has a good forward mix. I mean, you have the perfection line up top. They lead 1, 2, 3 in scoring for them. And, the good depth that kind of this team possesses, you talk about a guy like Eric Haula who's filled that role, and Mark McLaughlin could be another piece towards that puzzle in the playoffs for the Bruins.
Now, don't get me wrong. Mark McLaughlin, he hasn't exactly had what looks to be the best stats in terms of just regular stats. Like, he's had 3 goals, 0 assists in 10 games. But trust me, he is a difference maker in the depth. And when you consider guys, when you consider the Boston Bruins system, they are fantastic at making their forward depth impenetrable. You hear about all these guys who have these amazing defensive analytics coming from Boston's system. Guys like Per Lindholm when he was there. Guys like oh God, what's his name on Seattle? Carson Kuhlman. Guys like Anders Bjork. These guys had fantastic analytics when playing in the bottom six in Boston. And guys like Mark McLaughlin and Anton Bleed, they're no different. So it'll be very interesting to see how, even though they have this, very, very young depth group with guys like McLaughlin, it'll be very interesting to see how these guys perform at trying to shut down, Carolina, who of course has a very, very fantastic offense this season. And
Yeah.
I think another major key to Boston, going long in the playoffs is Taylor Hall. I mean, he's been solid this year, and he's historically been solid in the playoffs. He was a half a point per game player in the playoffs last year, but you really need him to play up to, I guess, his ability like a year or two, well, I guess not a year ago, but 2 to 3 years ago, in order to support that top line and to help on the power play. And I think if he does that, he could be a real game changer as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that that's necessary for the Bruins in this series. Honestly, if they're going to have a chance, they need that scoring depth because of the offense that Carolina possesses and because of the overall team depth that they have. I think that if Taylor Hall doesn't show up to support that top line, like it's nothing for the Bruins. They need to have that scoring support down their lineup, especially from a guy like Hall and a guy who can help on the power play, as you mentioned. So moving on to Carolina. Carolina finished with a 54-20-8 record this season, 116 points, so a good amount more than the Bruins. Sebastian Aho leads in scoring with 37 goals, 44 assists, 81 points. Svechnikov finished second, 30 goals, 39 assists, 69 points. And Teuvo Teravainen in third with 22 goals, 43 assists, and 65 points. The wins leader, as we mentioned, Frederik Andersen, had 35 on the season, and their last playoff appearance was last year in 2021. They defeated the Nashville Predators in 6 games, and then they lost to Tampa Bay in 5 games in the second round, and that series was all Tampa. We'll get to Tampa in a bit, of course, but Carolina coming into this one looking for a deep run, Jake.
Yeah, and it's not gonna be easy this season. Even though they've been such a fantastic team this season, as you mentioned, 116 points, over 50 wins. Like that's a season most teams, most fans die for. But they do have their fair share of issues. The main one is, of course, goaltending. Freddie Anderson doesn't exactly have a great history against the Boston Bruins, being as he was the starting goaltender of the Toronto Maple Leafs, a team that also hasn't had a great history against the Bruins. So lots of first-round exits, especially against that team. And worst of all, he won't be starting game one
Hmm.
as he's currently dealing with an injury. So if he is gone for at least the beginning of the first round, then the question is this series, you know, airtight? Is it close? Uh, and if he does come back, midway through the season, will he be in shape enough to be that game changer he was at the beginning of the season? And it's not just that, because when you consider Antti Ranta has been fantastic historically. He's been a very, very good goaltender, very underrated in Arizona. But, both these goalies are guys with injury histories. I mean, Freddie Anderson's currently injured right now. Antti Ranta has had injuries in the past. And we haven't seen Antti Ranta as the, starting goaltender in, 4 or 5 years. Because when he was in Arizona, his role ended up getting replaced by Darcy Kemper, who I'm sure we'll get to in the near future. But there's a lot of questions at goaltending, considering the injury to Freddie Anderson and even when he's healthy, his performances against Boston in the past. But they do have a lot of bright sides. Like don't get us wrong. Kotkaniemi is going to be a player to watch. I'm sure you could talk about his history as a playoff performer. But
Look, I think, yeah, well, if I can elaborate a bit on Kotkaniemi if you want, but a guy who has historically not necessarily been a player. I mean, he had a better year in the season this year, but in Montreal he struggled at points, at various points in his seasons in Montreal. And going into the playoffs, I mean, in 2020 he was a terrific goal scorer for Montreal in the bubble. Then in 2021 he kind of lit it up. I believe he went on a goal scoring streak, if I'm not mistaken. Scored
mhm.
obviously the overtime goal against the Leafs in Game 6, a big one to get the series started against the Jets in the second round, which led to Montreal sweeping Winnipeg. He's a player to watch in the playoffs, and especially if he's put in the right role with Carolina, he can definitely elevate his game for the playoffs. He is able to find the back of the net often when it comes to scoring in the playoffs. He was scratched in the Stanley Cup final, but I do believe that was more of a mistake coaching wise. And obviously, in the Stanley Cup final, Montreal didn't really put up much of a fight against Tampa Bay. So, I think that's more a matter of circumstance rather than saying anything about his game. Kokaniemi is a guy who can elevate for the playoffs. I think another former Hab who can as well is Max Domi, who's been pretty good since coming over. Didn't have a necessarily terrific playoff run with Montreal in 2020 when the bubble happened, but at the same time, he's the type of guy who can potentially elevate his game and bring a different role to a team like the Hurricanes in a bottom six role at forward in the playoffs. And if you want to go on and talk about Svechnikov and Aho, they are
Oh,
most likely going to perform.
oh, absolutely. It's just making sure that a lot of the newer acquisitions, guys like as we mentioned, Domi and Kotkaniemi, and more interestingly enough, Tony DeAngelo, who's been fantastic offensively this season, can perform playing the two-way playoff hockey. Because as many people mentioned about DeAngelo, besides the character issues that we've heard about, in Arizona and in New York, even if that's all gone, his defensive game is really, really concerning, especially if you're trying to make a deep run in the playoffs. He is among one of the worst like in terms of defensive ability, he's one of the worst in the entire league. Uh, Now, that being said, he is one of the best offensive defensemen in the league. But in order, for him to not be a liability, and in order to make sure that you're playing your best hockey, you can't just have him be protected by guys like Brett Pesce and Jacob Slavin, who are much better defensively and will have to hinder their offensive ability in order to compensate. You really want Tony DeAngelo to be the best he can be, not just offensively, but as an all-around defenseman. But it is also important that a lot of the younger guys uh, don't crack under pressure because, I mean, you look at the team, they've got guys like Seth Jarvis, they've got guys like Marty Necas. Um, these are young guys who have very little experience at the NHL, let alone in the playoffs. And it'll be very interesting to see how these guys are going to perform at the next level. But also the older players, like guys like Stahl, like Derek Stepan, if they can keep their performance. Stahl has been amazing as a two-way player this season, and Derek Stepan's even had a little bit of a bounce back since his time in Ottawa. So it'll be very interesting to see how this series goes.
And Jordan Stahl has a terrific record in the playoffs going back
Oh
his
yeah.
whole career. So, a guy who can really perform against the Bruins in the playoffs. And, if they go on a longer run, a guy who can really help this team in the future. So prediction time for series, our first recap of the series. I'm going to take the Carolina Hurricanes in 6. I really think this is a series that could go either way. I think if the Bruins get the goaltending, we spoke about their lack of experience, if they're able to kind of combat that, Swayman or Olmark, I should say, this series could go the way of Boston, and especially if they can get the support offensively and obviously be able to kind of hold the defensive zone well against a high-powering offense. I think the Bruins can win, but I think that the Hurricanes are going to come out, use the lack of goaltending experience for the Bruins in the playoffs to their advantage. Anderson will come back after Game 1 and play well, kind of rectify those demons that he's faced against the Bruins in the past, and I'm taking the Carolina Hurricanes to beat the Bruins in 6 games.
It's really tough because I think this is a lot more of a competitive series than people are making it out to be. And I'm going to go with if the Canes go to 7, I think the Bruins are going to win the series. But I don't know if it's going to go to 7. I think I'm going to say that it's going to go to 6 as well to the Canes. My big reason for that is that I just think that they're built better. Not necessarily for the playoffs, but they're just built better. They've got more depth in terms of quality. And even though as much as I like the perfection line, a lot of the core guys on that team are getting older. And I do think that the offense for Carolina is going to overpower them a little bit. So I'm gonna say Carolina in 6, but if it goes to 7, I wouldn't be surprised if the Bruins take it.
Awesome. Well, moving on to the next series we have, that's Florida and Washington, and we'll start off with the President's Trophy winning for the first time ever Florida Panthers, and they finished with a record of 58-18-6. 58 wins is the fifth, I believe, tied for the 5th most all-time in NHL history, for a total of 122 points on the year. And the leaders, Jonathan Huberdeau, 30 goals, 85 assists, most assists for a left winger in NHL history, and 115 total points, while Alexander Barkov is second with 39 goals, 49 assists, 88 points. Sam Reinhart in third, 33 goals, 49 assists, and 82 total points on the season. Sergei Bobrovsky is the leader in the wins category for the Panthers. He's got 39 wins on the season. And their last playoff appearance, last year they lost in the first round against the Tampa Bay Lightning in 6 games, but that was, as I recall, a series that could have gone either way. The Panthers were a fun, high-flying team in that series, a very, very good series between two top-end teams. Going to be interesting to see what the Panthers can do in this playoffs, obviously expecting a long run from them, and against a team like Washington, definitely just looking to kind of scoot their way past them and move on to the next one, but maybe more difficult of a series than people think or people could see coming, and we'll see if that's the case for the Panthers.
Well, 122 points. I think that is really what needs to be said there. They had 122 points this season. There's just so much top-end talent. It is so hard to contain. And not just in terms of offensive ability. They've got defensive guys. People talk about how good Ekblad is as a defenseman, how underrated he is. They've got Mackenzie Weegar, who's grown into such a fantastic defenseman over the last couple seasons, even though this season he has kind of not been as great as he was the year before. They have physicality from guys like Lomberg and Gudas, who have both been terrific. And it will allow Florida to not get bullied around by Washington, who's a very notably physically team. They're a team that you mentioned is built to last. They're looking to go on that run. This is their year. They are built very, very well, physical, with scoring depth and experience, a good mix of youth and vets. The only question is goaltending. Again, Sergei Bobrovsky, despite having 39 wins, he's streaky. This is a guy who could be a concern later on in the playoffs, especially with Knight not having too much experience in his own right and being a very, very green goaltender. I don't know if Bobrovsky, if he has a couple of bad games and they have to bring in Knight, I don't know if he'll be able to hit the ground running. And you mentioned just how good Bobrovsky has been this season in terms of wins. His save percentage isn't stellar. It's fine. It's great. It's good for this season, but he's not even close to the top 5. And so I'm really struggling to see if, he does end up going on an inconsistent streak, or he does have a couple of bad games, it could really hurt the Florida Panthers, and it could be their Achilles heel. But if that isn't the case, and he's very solid, I mean, this is a team that we've mentioned can go for a run. Like, this is
Yes.
fantastic team.
Definitely so, and I agree with Bobrovsky. I just think that also at the same time, I mean, we've seen it in the past. Bobrovsky has the ability to be a terrific goaltender, Vezina Trophy
Yeah.
winner. So if he can kind of find lightning in a bottle, I mean, we've seen Mike Smith and Edmonton kind of do that over the past couple of weeks, and just in the lead up to the playoffs, and they're obviously hoping to continue that. But we'll get to that in a moment. But if he can find that lightning in a bottle and carry this team, or help carry this team towards a place where they believe they can be, this can be a special summer for the Florida Panthers. And from Spencer Knight's perspective, if Bobrovsky struggles and they have to go to Knight, he's got next to no playoff experience, especially not at the NHL level. He's nothing. So it's going to be interesting to see what the deal is with the Panthers in net, and if they can support the obviously terrific team that they have. From a Washington perspective, so they come in obviously 22 points below that of the Florida Panthers. 44
Still
wins.
over 100.
Still over 100 though. Yes, exactly. 44 wins, 26 losses, 12 overtime losses on the year for a total of 100 points. Alex Ovechkin leads the way in scoring with a very clean line of 50 goals, 40 assists, 90 points. Evgeny Kuznetsov is second. He's got 24 goals, 54 assists, and 78 points on the year. John Carlson in third, the defenseman, 17 goals, 54 assists, and 71 points. Just a terrific season for Carlson. And then in net, Ilya Samsonov, 23 wins on the year, again on the lower side in comparison to some teams in the playoffs. And in last year's playoffs, they lost in the first round to the Boston Bruins in 5 games. Of course, one of the most memorable moments of that series was when the Capitals, that is, lost in overtime off the puck that was misplayed behind the net. But from a Capitals perspective, they're getting older. They've got a good mix of talent on the lineup, and they've been very, very injured throughout the season, Jake.
Speaking of injuries, I mean, the most concerning one, of course, is Alexander Ovechkin, who, as we saw, was kind of hurled into the boards a couple of games ago. Apparently, he's going to be fine for Game 1, but that's definitely a concern heading into this playoffs. But it's not just Ovechkin that's been injured. There's been a lot of key players who have missed a lot of time this season. Anthony Mantha, Nicholas Backstrom, TJ Oshie. These are guys that aren't just depth players. They're really the core of this team.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough. And, even though they have the physicality and they are a tough team to play both, physically and skill-wise, I'm really concerned that a lot of their skill guys have been missing a lot of time this past season. And if, Florida decides to kind of give them back what they're putting on them and start to play physical hockey, I don't know if the Washington Capitals will be able to, be the team that they have been this regular season, which, 100 points, still outstanding. It should be a good physical series, though.
Definitely.
There won't really be a physical advantage, which for a team like Washington, who is betting on that, it may hurt them. But the big concern is depth and goaltending. Like, the depth is very inexperienced. They have a lot of guys who have just recently come up from the minors, and it will be interesting to see how guys like Martin Fehérváry and Connor McMichael will perform, even though they've had very little experience in the playoffs, and they do have a lot of upside. I'm just not too sure if they're ready, and especially Joe Snively. This is a guy who's been fantastic this season. I believe he has 7 points in 15 games last time I checked. And they could help sway the series, but I'm just not too sure if they're ready. They do have some decent depth pieces, though. Guys like Johan Larsson, who they brought in from Arizona at trade deadline, and Nick Dowd. They could shut down a couple of guys on Florida, a couple of the better players. But Florida just has so much talent that I don't know if they'll be able to contain all of it. It's going to be real difficult.
Yeah,
I think this is going to be a major concern for Washington moving forward.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that, out of all the points you said, it could kind of be countered with, but the Panthers, and
Yeah.
I think that because of that, that's a credit to what the Panthers have built. They built a team, like we both mentioned in the past, could last and should last in the playoffs. They're built to play a physical game if they need to. They're built to play a skilled game if they need to. They're built to play a shutdown game if they need to. And, they're a team that, it'd be a very big disappointment if they were to get bounced as early as the first or second round, they have the ability to go far, and a team like Washington could potentially live up to that, but I don't believe that they have the capabilities, because every point that had been listed for the Capitals just could be countered with, yeah, but they are facing the Panthers, and that's a concern to me, and I think it is to a lot of people out there. So, prediction time again here for this second series. I've got the Panthers in 5. I think that Florida, as mentioned, is built to go long in the playoffs. They were terrific against Tampa last year in the first round, despite Tampa just kind of overpowering their way to 2 Stanley Cups. I think that the energy that they had in that series will come back and kind of bring it up against Washington. With all the talent they have, it gives them the edge, definitely, to take this series. And, I just believe that the Panthers, as mentioned, are built to go long. I do think that the Capitals take a game at home. I think that they could easily get swept. And, at the same token, I think that if the Panthers are struggling in net, as we've seen and as we've heard in the past, I think that it could go by way of the Capitals by way of the Panthers in 6, maybe a little bit closer series, but I still think the Panthers are going to win it in 5. I gave the Capitals a game, but I think the Panthers take care of business in 5 games.
I'm not even going to give the Capitals a game, honestly.
Really?
They do have a good team, and they could be more of a contender next year with healthy seasons from guys like Mantha and Backstrom. I was really impressed with how Dmitry Orlov was able to kind of have a bounce-back season and even put up his career high in points. But just with the amount of injuries, the lack of experience to go far, and the aging core, and most importantly, the goaltending, I just feel like it will not fare well against the Panthers, who are one of the top goal-scoring teams. I just don't think it's going to work. But one thing that must be mentioned is that it's kind of a good thing that a lot of teams with goaltending issues are going against teams with goaltending issues. So maybe some of these goalies could catch fire and could end up really being, the goalie that could bring teams to the next round and even further.
Definitely so. That's a very good point. All right, so let's move right on to the next series, and this will be an interesting one. We've got the Toronto Maple Leafs against the Tampa Bay Lightning, and Toronto, we'll start with them. They come in with a 54-21-7 record on the year, total of 115 points. Very, very good season for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Austin Matthews winning the Rocket Richard, scoring 60 goals on the year, 46 assists, and 106 points on the year as well. Mitch Marner in second. He's got 35 goals, 62 assists, 97 points. While William Nylander, those big three up at the top 3 for the Leafs. Nylander had 34 goals, 46 assists, and 80 points, that is, on the year. The wins leader is Jack Campbell with 31. That'll be a question mark we'll talk about as well. And then their last playoff appearance, of course, the elusive series loss to the Montreal Canadiens in last year's Stanley Cup playoffs, up 3-1. They lose in 7. Leafs will be looking to win and move on to the second round for the first time since 2003. And there are a lot of topics of discussion to talk about with the Toronto Maple Leafs, Jake. You've got Matthews and Marner at the top, who didn't perform in last year's playoffs. You've got the defense that has been shaky in the past in the playoffs. You've got the goaltending, and they're matching up against a good team, a great team that is in Tampa Bay, who's coming off, of course, 2 straight Stanley Cup wins. Going to be a tough task for the Leafs, but what can they do to be able to kind of come through? What do they need, do you think?
They need to hope and pray. I mean, look, all right. This might sound quite bullish, but I think that there is a very, very major issue with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and it's not just one issue. This is a team where everyone always says they're about one asset away, and then they get an asset, and then time and time again, it's proven to be not the case.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is more than just we're one piece away. I think it's an issue with the pieces that they have. I mean, John Tavares, he hasn't been living up to his contract, but he's still been a very good player. It'll be very interesting to see how he'll come to play in this series, especially missing so much of the series before in Montreal, which I'm pretty sure he was performing very well against Montreal.
Yes.
Up to that point. But in terms of the top-end talent, they need to show up. Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Riley, and even Campbell to an extent. They need to show up. I mean, Jack Campbell, he'd been fantastic during the playoffs last year and was one of the best goalies at the beginning of the season. But the injuries, the inconsistency, you can't even call it inconsistency when he's been consistently bad up until about March or April.
Yeah.
And then you've got Shelgren as the backup. This is a guy who, up to February, had no NHL experience whatsoever and was not even considered an NHL factor. Nobody really thought of him as an NHL prospect. They brought him up because of necessity, and while he did have a couple of decent games, he hasn't been able to steal games, which is very important if you're in the playoffs. You need a hot goalie that can steal games. Toronto has none of them. And then you consider Morgan Rielly. And I mean, there's a lot to be said about Morgan Rielly as an offensive defenseman. He is fantastic. He's got good passing. He's good in transition. He's got a decent shot. But defensively, he's a liability.
Yes.
I mean, people don't mention his lack of defensive... It's not even a lack of defensive ability. It's a lack of care to play defense. People don't mention it. But it's Tyson Barrie level. It's really concerning, especially for a team like the Toronto Maple Leafs, who have had defensive issues in the past. And while people can mention that, this is the highest scoring Toronto Maple Leafs defense in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. But the problem is, it's not that their defense can't score. It's that their defense can't defend. They can't do their job. And while they did bring in guys like Lyubushkin, who is, I mean, to put it very bluntly, a defense-only defenseman, there's still some concerns. Maybe it's a system issue with Sheldon Keefe, but I'm really concerned still at this point, like 5 years into this, this run. I'm really concerned that this team still cannot make it out of the first round. And I mean, Matthews and Marner, they've been fantastic this year. You look at what Matthews have been able to do. This is a guy who, I mean, previously has been kind of a defensive liability. He's really stepped up his game this year, not just offensively with the 60 goals, as you mentioned, 106 points, but also defensively. He's probably a Selke candidate this year. He's a Hart candidate this year. I mean, fantastic. But him and Marner, they both are known for not showing up in the playoffs either. I mean, everyone makes jokes about Marner with his delayed game penalties and Matthews just being a non-factor. These guys need to show up. And you add all this, and you consider the depth. I mean, last year, you look at guys like Kerfoot. Kerfoot's been fine this year. I don't really have any concerns about him. But Spezza was one of the pieces that last year in the playoffs was performing. You look at him this year, I mean, Spezza is playing like you'd expect a 37-year-old player to play. Wayne Simmons has lost a step. Yes, they have guys like Michael Bunting. And Bunting's been great. He's had a great rookie season, although people can definitely make arguments on whether he should win the Calder or not. He's been good. There's no question about that. But there's a lot of issues that the Leafs have this year, and I think this is a make-or-break year for the Cup aspirations and a make-or-break year for Sheldon Keefe and Dubas as management of this team. I mean, they certainly have the upfront skill to win, but this is not a good match for Toronto, and I don't think Toronto's ready. They need to show up.
Yeah,
it's a concern.
Definitely so. I'd agree. Something that's interesting to point out, I believe that Bunting is not going to be... He was an extra today at practice, so was Spezza and Justin Hall, as well as Rasmus Sandin. It's going to be interesting to see what their lineups looks like. Right today they had Kerfoot on the top line with Matthews and Marner. I think that if you compare it to the team they had last year going into the playoffs, I mean, you look at the team last year, you say, oh, they're going to steamroll the Habs. They're going to... First of all, I think it's important to mention also, we're a Senators fan and a Canadiens fan talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's going to be tough for us to kind of say that they're going to move on. I think that if they do perform, and if they do get the goaltending, because Campbell was terrific at times last year in the playoffs, I think that if he can kind of, once again, find that form and be able to shut down a lethal Tampa Bay attack, they have a chance, but they really need a lot of things to go their way. They need some puck luck as well to go their way. This is not a favorable matchup. And my question to you, Jake, I was going to go on and kind of say that their lineup in comparison to what it was last year with Hyman in the lineup and a couple of other guys. Spezza, obviously, as you mentioned, performing to a very, very high capability last year in the playoffs. Nylander was terrific last year in the series. You're just saying, like, maybe their team is not necessarily the caliber that it was last year in the Canadian division, especially at this time of year when everyone thought, myself included, they should steamroll through the North Division onto the third round, but obviously that wasn't the case. And my question to you, Jake, is do you think that they would have been better off in any other matchup other than Tampa Bay, say Boston, or even Florida?
I mean, honestly, I feel like if they went up against a team like Washington, if they went up against a team like Pittsburgh, if they went up against a team like the New York Rangers, even Boston at this point, I don't think we'd be having this conversation to this extent, but I also feel that, like, this is a team that has literally won 2 back-to-back Stanley Cup championships. They have players with cup fatigue, and they've been replaced internally already. Like, you talk about how good, guys like Braden Point were 2 seasons ago, or Anthony Cirelli. Cirelli hasn't been as good offensively, but defensively, he's putting up Selke numbers. Like, he's been fantastic. And Braden Point, yes, he hasn't been as great offensively, but Steven Stamkos, as we'll get into, is having quite the season himself. And Kucherov, even though he missed, half the season, he's been fantastic as well. So I think this is a terrible matchup for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I think it's a terrible matchup just in general. If you're a Leaf fan, I feel so bad for you. But I do want to mention one thing, actually.
Yes,
I forgot to mention this. Another concern is Jack Campbell hasn't been great when he's been put under the spotlight. This is something I've noticed because he was having his fantastic, absolutely fantastic beginning of the season campaign. There weren't a lot of expectations on him, especially with Mrazek getting the contract to essentially be. He got the starter contract. He got $3.7 million for 3 years. The expectation was that it's at least going to be a 1A 1B situation. And Jack Campbell came out of the gates running. He was fantastic. He had a .940 save percentage at some points of the season. Absolutely ludicrous. But then as people started to pick up on this and, people started throwing the word Vezina around and, he got his All-Star nomination. As this started to happen, his play fell off a cliff. And so, considering that this is not just a Canadian market, but considering that, first round, the bad omen that the Toronto Maple Leafs have in the first round, and all the media speculation around it, I don't think it's going to be good for Campbell either. And one thing we didn't mention was also Giordano, and how he's been a major piece that the team has brought in. As great as he's been, and for as long as he's played in the NHL, he only has 23 games of playoff experience. And he hasn't exactly been great in all of them. So I'm really concerned about that aspect as well. I mean, Giordano, former Norris Trophy winner, especially late in his career, but can he be the difference maker that the team needs on defense? And if so, that might solve a few of their issues, and maybe the goaltending won't be as much of an issue, and maybe they can make it by Tampa. But, again, this is not a great matchup. Tampa's a fantastic team.
Yeah.
So, yeah, certainly against Boston, maybe against Carolina, definitely against the New York Rangers, Washington, and Pittsburgh. It could have been a lot easier of a series for Toronto, and I'm sure they could have won, but against Tampa, I'm really concerned. And we'll get into why.
Yeah, so for Tampa, we'll go right ahead. So Tampa finished with 51 wins, 23 losses, 8 overtime losses on the year, 110 points in total for the Tampa Bay Lightning, 5 back of the Leafs. First leading scorer is Steven Stamkos, 42 goals, 64 points, or 64 assists, that is 106 points in total. Victor Hedman with a terrific season on D, 20 goals, 65 assists, 85 points. Third, very interesting, Nikita Kucherov. In 47 games played, he scored 25 goals, 44 assists, and a total of 69 points. And I highlighted 47 games played.
On pace for 119.
Exactly. So,
full season.
That's the Kucherov that the Tampa Bay Lightning have seen and have wanted to see over the past few years. Andrei Vasilevsky, of course, in net for Tampa. He had 39 wins on the year coming into this one. He's their guy, and he will be their guy throughout the playoffs. Last year, of course, winning the Stanley Cup. Two-time Stanley Cup champions. Last year, they defeated Florida in the first round in 6 games, then Carolina in 5. Then the Islanders took them to 7, but they prevailed. The Tampa Bay Lightning did. And the Habs, they beat them in 5 to win the Cup for the second year in a row. And this team is once again expected to make a long run. We'll see if Cup fatigue comes in to kind of play a role for them, or against them, that is. But their depth speaks for itself. And as you mentioned earlier, Jake, just the ability to replace guys who could be on Cup fatigue with other guys in the bottom 6. That could play a massive factor in the series. Guys like Nick Paul and Corey Perry, who were acquired in the offseason and at the trade deadline, that could play a big role in helping them get to that point once again this year.
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, the Nick Paul, Corey Perry, they've been absolutely fantastic since joining the team. Nick Paul has been playing first line on Tampa since joining, which is a bit of a shock. He's had multiple highlight reel plays since joining, something that, of course, Sens fans would love to admit they originally thought of him that highly, but I'm going to be honest, Nick Paul hasn't always been a fan favorite, so it is quite interesting to see how much he's succeeded in Tampa. And not just that, there's also Ross Colton. He's had 20 goals, 40 points, notably the Florida Panthers killer in the first round last year. And as you mentioned, Corey Perry, he's had a bounce-back season, and he's notoriously been a playoff performer. He was very good in the playoffs in Montreal, correct?
Yes, he was. Fourth line.
And, I don't want to mention how good of a playoff performer he was in 2007, considering it was against the Sens, but let me just say he's one of the better players. What is there to be said? I mean, Vasilevsky is having his worst statistical season. A .917 save percentage with 39 wins on the year. Like, even in his worst season, he's still miles ahead of almost everybody in the league. It's unbelievable. This guy needs to be tested. And, I mean, he's historically been insane during the playoffs. And you could mention, well, okay, what if Vasilevsky gets injured? They do have Elliott. And Elliott has been fantastic in the playoffs as well, although he has been a little bit spotty. So it could be an issue, but he's been very, very good this season. And, I really have no concerns with goaltending whatsoever, and I think it's definitely one of their biggest strengths. But that being said, everything on Tampa is a strength. Hedman, Stamkos, Killorn, they're all putting up all-time best point totals. And, I mean, Kucherov on pace for 119 points. It's ridiculous. What else is there? What else is there to be said? This is a team that has won 2 Stanley Cups in a row, and they're definitely on the prowl for the 3rd. Can they do it? It's entirely possible.
Yep, I'd agree 100%. So prediction time, I've got Tampa winning in 7. And the reason I have them in 7, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people, Tampa in 6, maybe even more. But I'm saying Tampa in 7 because I think the Leafs are going to compete in this series. I think they're going to lose, though. I think that Matthews and Marner, unlike in the past couple of years, they will show up and play well in the playoffs. This is the year where they're going to show that they can do that. And it's going to be a back-and-forth series in my mind. If you look at the head-to-head on the season, a lot of back-and-forth games. Obviously, you can't really take much into the playoffs from the season, but at the same time, a lot of back-and-forth in between the two teams with regard to the amount of games they played. I do think, though, that Tampa has that playoff experience, has that depth to be able to come out and top in a series like this. And though I'm giving the Leafs a chance going to 7 games, I still believe that Tampa comes out on top and makes their way towards another long playoff run. We'll see if that's the case. And a big question mark if this series does result in the Leafs losing, especially not losing in a convincing manner, is it the end for Keefe and Dubas? Maybe Keefe, we shall see, due to the fact that they cannot get by the first round. So that's a big question mark that's up in the air, and we will see if that's the case for the Toronto Maple Leafs.
So for me, I'm going to say Tampa in 5. I think that this is going to be the year that changes a lot in Toronto. I'm really concerned about the Leafs goaltending, and they do have a track record of lacking poise in big moments. I personally think this is more of a systematic issue than it is a player issue. I mean, everyone can talk about how great the individuals are on the Leafs, but when they can't perform on a yearly basis in the playoffs, I don't necessarily think it's like a player issue. I think it's definitely a coaching. And you can mention Sheldon Keefe's great track record in the OHL. You can mention his great track record in the AHL. But as you would know yourself, just because somebody has great coaching in junior, like Dominique Ducharme, doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be a fantastic coach in the NHL. I think there's a lot of issues with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think the biggest one is definitely Sheldon Keefe. And I think if Sheldon Keefe goes, Dubas gets the boot, because this is the second coach under Dubas, the first one being, of course, Babcock, who has also had his issues in the playoffs. And I think this is going to be the wake-up call. I think there are going to be some big moves that are made to Toronto, and I think they could really come out ahead in the offseason if they were to make these moves. But I think, of course, it's too early to tell. Toronto's got a fantastic team. It is entirely possible they do compete, but I'm going to be a little bit bullish here, and I'm going to say that Tampa's going to win in 5.
Nice. All right, so the next series, and we'll maybe speed it up a bit, but the Rangers and the Penguins. Rangers had a record of 52, 24, and 6 on the year, 110 points. Artemi Panarin leads the team in points with only 22 goals, 74 assists for a total of 96 points, but the 74 points, or assists that is, that's a large total for him. Mika Zibanejad in second. He had 29 goals in the year, 52 assists, and 81 points. Chris Kreider, 52 goals. 50-goal season for Kreider, 25 assists, and 77 total points. The wins leader, and a Hart Trophy candidate to boot, Igor Shesterkin, 36 wins on the year. And their last playoff appearance came in the bubble in 2020 when they got swept in the 3-game series the best 3 of 5 series against the Carolina Hurricanes. A lot of interesting factors for the Rangers. They've got good depth. Andrew Kopp has been very good since coming over from Winnipeg. Chris Kreider, of course, 50 goals. Panarin, 96 points. This is just a very, very strong team that expects to break out from their rebuild in this Stanley Cup playoff.
I'm going to actually disagree with what you said about the good depth. I think they have a lot of good top-end talent, and guys like Andrew Kopp, who may have been depth on Winnipeg, have been promoted to higher roles since joining the team. But I truly believe there's a complete lack of depth, and I really think this is going to hurt the team. They've got guys like Dryden Hunt, Kevin Rooney, Patrick Nemeth, and these are definitely not guys that you want on your team if you're looking to make a deep run. No offense to them, but Patrick Nemeth hasn't necessarily been a great defenseman for a number of years. Kevin Rooney is more of a 13th forward, and Dryden Hunt was struggling to make Arizona. This is not a good look for the New York Rangers. And while they did get 110 points, that is solely because of goaltending. I mean, the performance, of course, you could say Panarin, Zibanejad, and Chris Kreider, they were fantastic this year. But the performance of Igor Shesterkin this year has been legendary. At points, he's been one of the best goaltenders to ever play hockey. And that's no joke. That's no joke. He's had, at a point this season, I believe the second best save percentage in the history of the NHL. You can't make that up. That is fantastic. This guy is literally a franchise goaltender in a league where it's tough to call goaltenders elite.
Yes.
Can he carry the New York Rangers through this series? That is the big question. He doesn't have NHL playoff experience, but he does in the KHL and in the MHL, and he's been pretty good while doing so. He also has the highest goal save above average in the NHL with 45. And if you follow that stat at all, having 20 is an outlier. I mean, he's double what an excellent goalie would be in terms of individual performance. And also to note, he's been very good this season against Pittsburgh. And so, while the New York Rangers are a bit of a one-trick pony, I mean, Chris Kreider, again, 50 goals, but let's face it, 30 of those were tap-ins. And Artemi Panarin has been good, although He's been a bit more inconsistent in terms of his defensive ability, and Mika Zibanejad is known for being inconsistent, going on tangents where he doesn't score at all and then scoring a 7-goal game right afterwards. I mean, it's a tough team to evaluate, especially in the playoffs, but they reasonably have a shot. I mean, they have a really hot goaltender, and they have some pretty solid upfront talent, and they have a lot of younger guys, too. Guys like Capo Caco and Alexis Lafreniere, who may or may not have had necessarily great seasons, but if they, for example, pull out a Kotkaniemi and have a good playoff performance, this could be really monumental for their development.
Definitely so, I agree. And on the other side of it, we got the Pittsburgh Penguins, and of course they have got a long track record of playoff success. They come into this series 46, 25, and 11 with their record on the year, 103 points. Jake Guentzel leads the way in scoring with 40 goals, 44 assists, and 84 total points. Sidney Crosby matches that points total. He's got 31 goals, 53 assists for a total of 84 points on the year. And Chris Letang rounding up the top three in third, 10 goals, 58 assists for a total of 68 points on the year, but that's a far drop from Crosby and Guentzel down to Letang. Wins leader Tristan Jarry, also been very, very strong for the Penguins on the year, 34 wins on the season, and their last playoff appearance comes last year. They lost in 6 games to the New York Islanders. Interesting team. I think we've spoken about this in the past, Jake, as Malkin and Letang potentially making their last go of the cup with the Pittsburgh Penguins, potentially leaving in the offseason. We shall see if that's the case. A guy like Rickard Rakell coming over since being traded from Anaheim. He's been very, very strong for them. So, a lot of different pieces for Pittsburgh. Obviously, you've got the guys at the top like Crosby and Guentzel, but definitely a lot of energy throughout this group that has the ability to carry them through in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of players on this team. I mean, it's a team that you look at, and you look at a lot of the flaws before you look at the positives. And yes, I mean, guys like Malkin and Letang and even Crosby to a certain extent maybe slowing down a bit. And Jarry has had his inconsistencies in the past. This is a team that could surprise. As you mentioned, Malkin and Letang, they're both pending UFAs at the end of the season. So does that give them the incentive to go for it? I mean, if this is truly the last season with most of the gang still there, I can definitely see them gain a lot of motivation and potentially pull off an upset. Rakell has been great, 20 goals on the year, first time for him since 2017-18, but he has been historically inconsistent in the playoffs, either being very good or very underwhelming. Mm-hmm. Other guys that they have, Evan Rodriguez has kind of broken into a very solid core player. He's a 40-point scorer for the first time in his career after being one of the worst players in the league. So it'll be very interesting to see if that production translates to the playoffs. And, I mean, really, there's been a lot of guys on the team who have been injured as well. I mean, Brian Rust has been absolutely fantastic. He's been a point-per-game player, but he's only played about 50 to 60 games in the year. So they kind of have the Washington issue where a lot of their guys have been injured, and so how will that affect them moving forward? Tristan Jarry, like I said, inconsistent in the past, but he has been very good this year. He hasn't yet had playoff success, but he was backing up Matt Murray, of course, in the final run. So he does have that Stanley Cup experience. I guess he's been there, but he hasn't played there. So it'll be very interesting to see if maybe he actually performs very well. But overall, I mean, this is a team that, like the New York Rangers, they could surprise. They're definitely on the lower end of points, both teams, 110 and 103 respectively, which is a lot, but the Eastern Conference is stacked. And it'll be very interesting to see how this series goes.
For sure. Well, prediction time once again. I've got the Rangers winning in 6, and that might come as a bit of a surprise, but I think Igor Shesterkin is the guy for the Rangers, and I think that he will help carry them to the second round of this series. I think that Pittsburgh is on the decline. in regard to where they're at as a team, and I think the Rangers are on the rise as well. We noted the depth issues, and that could potentially come into play for sure, but I still think that the Rangers, carried really by Igor Shesterkin, will move on in 6 games. It could go to 7, and Pittsburgh definitely could take the series as well. This is one of those series, once again, that could go either way. We talk about Carolina and Boston. But, I think that the Rangers have the capability with the top-end talent coming back to be able to have that success after the difficulty in the bubble to get past the Carolina Hurricanes. I think the Rangers move on in 6 games.
Yeah, I actually think the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to win in 7. You said it may come as a surprise for the Rangers one. I think it's going to come as a surprise for Pittsburgh. I think this is a very close series. Both teams are comparatively to the rest of the division, I guess it's not a shut-in series. This is definitely one that could go either way. And I think because of the contract years in play for both Malkin and Letang, I definitely think they'll work hard. And I also think Jari won't crack under pressure. As even though that this has been the most games he's played in a single season, he's been very rock solid with a .919 save percentage the last time I checked. And I also think that the depth will help sway the series for Pittsburgh. So I'm going to go with Pittsburgh.
So moving on to the Western Conference, we've got a couple interesting matchups going on in the West, and we'll start off with maybe a lopsided one in the Colorado Avalanche and the Nashville Predators. And we'll start off with the Avs. They come in with a record of 56, 19, and 7 on the year. Leaders in points, Mikko Rantanen finishes first, 36 goals, 56 assists, 92 points on the year. Nathan MacKinnon in second, 32 goals, 56 assists, and 88 points on the year. 28 goals for Nazem Kadri, who finishes third, 59 assists, and 87 points. And as mentioned before with the record, 119 points on the year for Colorado. Darcy Kemper leads the way in wins. We spoke about him a little bit earlier in regard to Arizona and Antti Ranta. 37 wins on the year for Kemper. And last year in the playoffs, they swept by the St. Louis Blues rather easily. And then they lost to the Vegas Golden Knights in 6 games last year. So an interesting one for the Colorado Avalanche, kind of known in the playoffs for the past few years of, falling off when they maybe shouldn't have, losing in 2020 to the Dallas Stars. Can they find it this year? Can they find what they need to in order to make a prolonged run in the playoffs and get to the promised land? We shall see with this core. It's going to be very interesting to see. They've got Makar and Devon Taves on the back end, of course. They're going up against Roman Josi, probably the best defenseman in hockey this year. 3 of the best defensemen in hockey, a combination of those 3. So going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Avalanche in this playoff run in my mind.
Yeah, this is definitely the battle for the Norris. I mean, you've got Makar and you've got Josi. These are 2 literal game-changing defensemen. The way that these players play, they command the other team to play to their style. So it'll be very interesting to see which one has more of, I guess, a presence on the ice. But can Makar and Taves battle Josi? I mean, he's been absolutely fantastic this year. Maybe the 2 best offensive defensemen in this season going up against each other. And furthermore, I mean, Josi's having one of the best seasons in a long, long time. Bednar is very optimistic that Landeskog will play Game 1. If so, that is a very huge piece for the Colorado Avalanche. Just a main member of the core who is having a very good season. Also of note, Darcy Kemper, 37 wins, as you mentioned. He carried the Coyotes in the bubble and was really the only strong piece against the Avs. He was also great in Minnesota for the 2014 playoffs, which was actually against the Avs as well. So they have very, very solid goaltending, and that will be a non-factor this playoffs. They additionally have a lot of depth. But notably, Jack Johnson surprisingly has been all right this year. He's actually become a little bit of a fan favorite. And they do have Nazem Kadri, who, of course, is having a fantastic season, 87 points. The real question, though, is will his suspension history in the playoffs continue, or will he play a little bit of a cleaner game now that he's found much better offensive success in Colorado? You could definitely mention about how Arturi Lehkonen has been a fantastic contributor during the run that the Montreal Canadiens have, and how he'll be a great piece for the Colorado Avalanche. But yeah, Bowen Byram as well. He's had 16 points in 29 games. He's had some concussion issues, but he's been also very good, and he is back. He he adds to the ridiculous defense that the Colorado Avalanche possess, and is definitely a player to watch as a potential game changer.
Definitely so. Moving right along to the other side of the series, Nashville Predators. They come in with a 45-30-7 record, 97 points. Leaders in points, Roman Josi, as we mentioned, 23 goals, 73 assists, 96 points. That's the most since Ray Bourque did it way back in the 90s. And Matt Duchene is in second. He had 43 goals, 43 assists, 86 points. And funnily enough, Philip Forsberg, 42 goals, 42 assists, that is, for a total of 84 points on the year. So 43, 43, 46 for Duchene, 42, 42, 84 for Forsberg. And just a very kind of interesting, weird numbers thing going on there for the Panther or for
84
the
for Forsberg.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, wins leader for the Nashville Predators. We've spoken about him. He's been a hot button discussion over the past couple of days. UC Saros, 38 wins. Been a very big piece to their success, if not the main piece to their success. And last year in the playoffs, they got bounced in the first round by the Carolina Hurricanes in 6 games. Well, Saros being injured in this series is a big factor. And that's probably going to be one of the biggest things for the Predators. They are saying over the past day or so that it's going to be a 4 to 6 week injury. And if he's out the entirety of the playoffs, it's going to be next to impossible, if not impossible, very difficult overall for the Nashville Predators to move on in the playoffs. But they do have good high quality pieces that have shown that they can do a lot of good things this season. Obviously, Roman Josi on the back end. So what's to like from the Panthers going into this playoff series?
You mean from the Predators?
Oh my god! Excuse me.
No worries. The Predators. It's such a shame that UC Saros has come down with an injury. He's been really one of the top goaltenders in the league. He's definitely been at least a top 5 goaltender, if not higher, up until this point. And it's really interesting because while people saw him as the definitive successor for Pekka Rinne, nobody saw him to be able to play up to that level of ability. And it's such a shame that we won't be able to see him at least for the first round of this series, which could be the entirety of Nashville's playoffs. And we'll definitely get into that. Tanner Jeannot has been a fantastic rookie player this past season. He's not only been one of the top producing rookies, but he's also been one of the most physical. In fact, he's, I think, last time I checked, leading the league in fights. And he's a good hard-nosed kid from Oxbow, Saskatchewan. And he's been just ridiculous. Kind of a surprise, as nobody really saw him as that kind of game-changing prospect. But the 24-year-old's he's definitely got some skill. And additionally, I'm a big fan of John Hines' coaching. If the Preds can play a more playoff-style defensive shutdown level of hockey, it could be a tougher series. But, with UC Saros gone and having to rely on Big Save Dave, who, if you want to know how he's been playing this year, I'm sure you've seen the clip of him a couple days ago running into the crossbar. That's a perfect analogy for his play this past season. And historically, he hasn't been great in the playoffs either. In fact, he notoriously got booed by the Nashville crowd when he was a member of the Calgary Flames. And it rattled him for the entirety of the series. So I'm not too confident in the Predators, and it's a real shame because so many guys on that team like Duchene and Ryan Johansson had real bounce-back seasons. And it's tough that, the likelihood is that they won't make it past the first round. But, there is next year.
Definitely. Prediction-wise, I'm going to say the Avs take this one in 5. I mean, if Saros doesn't play, it's going to be tough for Nashville. But I do think, like you said, Jake, they have good pieces, do the Predators. And I'm going to give them a game at home, either games 3 or 4. I think they'll be able to take one. But I don't think that they have the ability to take down this Avs team in the playoffs. Like you said, maybe next year they have the ability to kind of improve on what they have, bring Saros back in and make maybe a deeper run. But this year, just not the year for them, especially with the matchup they've been given. I'm saying Avs in 5.
I feel like with Saros in the lineup, this series could have easily won 7. In fact, it might even sway to Nashville because of just the style of hockey that they play. But considering that Saros is not there, I'm going to say this is going to be a sweep. I'm going to say Colorado in 4. Riddick has not been good this year. He hasn't been good the year before, and there's a reason why he was a third string on Toronto last year. Um, he's had issues playing in the postseason, and just with the lack of depth, both on forward and defense, this is a real problem against the deep and loaded Avalanche team.
Definitely so. Moving right on to Minnesota and St. Louis. A very, very stereotypical Central Division matchup that we have here. The Wild come in with a record of 53, 22, and 7, 113 points on the year. Kirill Kaprizov leads the way in points. He had a 47-goal season, 61 assists, 108 points for Kirill the Thrill. Kevin Fiala, 33 goals, 52 assists, 85 points. Matt Zuccarello in third. He had 24 goals, 55 assists, and a total of 79 points on the year for the former New York Ranger. And the wins leader for Minnesota is Cam Talbot. He had 32, goaltending obviously a discussion coming into this series with Marc-Andre Fleury. And last year in the playoffs, Minnesota lost in the first round to the Vegas Golden Knights in 7 games, though they did put up a very good fight against a good Golden Knights team. And we'll see if Minnesota can feed off of that. Obviously, a very good year for them and a lot of different opportunities for them to make something happen in the playoffs this year, especially going up against the Blues.
Yeah, they're a very interesting team. Everyone always talks about how they're kind of in a time crunch with the buyouts of Ryan Suter and the buyout of Zach Parise coming into full-blown effect in the next couple of years. So they've locked down a majority of their core, and surprisingly, it has been working very well. Guys like Matt Dumba and Jonas Brodin and Jared Spurgeon have been fantastic defensively this past year. Even guys that they brought in on a whim, like Goligoski, has been terrific. Just adding on to that solid D-core that could be poised to potentially make a run. Additionally, not just that, but on forward, Kirill Kaprizov, second season, no sophomore slump needed, 108 points, as you said. He's been everything as advertised and more. This guy is moxie in a bottle. But they do have a lot of other pieces, like Matt Zuccarello. Even though he's 34, he is having his best season in his entirety of his career, as well as Kevin Fiala. And these guys, along with Eriksson Ek, were great in the playoffs last year. And to add on to that, they have guys like Marco Rossi, who could step in as a depth piece, and Matt Boldy, who's been just an unstoppable force of nature since getting the call-up midway through the season. The real question, though, is goaltending. Marc-Andre Fleury was brought in at the trade deadline. He's been 8-2 since joining the Wild, last time I checked. And he has that Stanley Cup pedigree, but his individual stats aren't as good as Cam Talbot, so it'll be very interesting to see who starts for the Minnesota Wild. And nevertheless, if he gets hot with this team, they can do damage. And other notes is that Marcus Foligno, one of the better players defensively and offensively on the team, is battling through a knee injury, which he will apparently play through. So it'll be interesting to see if that hinders his game in any way, or if he's able to put up as much power and as much production as he has been throughout the season. And there's also the note that Dean Evison, fantastic coach. He won Coach of the Year last year. So he knows how to coach a team. And despite the fact that they didn't go far in the playoffs, this is definitely a year where they can do some damage.
Yeah, I saw the Wild play one time this year when I was in Montreal, and just they have a lot of depth to their team. The way they move the puck around in the offensive zone is really, really, really strong. They're a tight defensive team as well. As you mentioned, the question will be goaltending. We'll see who gets in, who plays, how well do either of the guys play. It's going to be interesting to see what the Wild can do in the playoffs, especially, as you mentioned, and maybe the last year before the Parise and Suter contracts get a little bit difficult for them. As for the St. Louis Blues, they come in with a 49, 22, and 11 record on the year, good for 109 points. Vladimir Tarasenko leads the way in points with 82 goals, 34 and 48 assists on the year for a total of 82. Robert Thomas in second. He had a 20-goal season, 57 assists and 77 points. And Pavel Buchnevich, acquired from the New York Rangers, a 30-goal season for him with 46 assists for a total of 76 points on the year. The wins leader is Ville Husso, although he split time with Jordan Binnington throughout the year. Husso only had 25 wins on the season, but that's largely because he and Binnington split time. And their last playoff appearance, spoken about a little bit earlier, they lost against the Colorado Avalanche, getting swept cleanly in the first round in 4 games. So they're going to look to bounce back against the Wild in a much more convincing way than they did in last year's playoffs when they just really didn't stand a chance against that Avs team. Something to note for the Blues is that they went 3-0-0, 2 games in OT, however, but 3-0-0 against the Minnesota Wild. But lots of goals in all games for both teams, and obviously all 3 games were close, with 2 of them going to overtime. So going to be interesting to see if that kind of translates over to the series and what exactly happens in regard to matchups between these 2 teams. So an interesting St. Louis Blues team coming into this series, to say the least, and we'll see how they kind of perceive the rest of this playoff run.
Yeah, so it should be Ville Husso and Nets, who, as you said, has been spending time with Jordan Binnington. Binnington did come in as the starter at the beginning of the season. Of course, riding off of the year before and the year previous to that, where he had his hot season, where he ended up becoming the starting goaltender and leading the team to the cup. Or, sorry, the year before that as well. But nevertheless, Husso has become the starter kind of midway through the season just by performing fantastically in relief of Binnington, who has been struggling a little bit this past year. This is his first playoff experience, so it'll be interesting to see if he does crack under pressure. And if that is the case, they do have Binnington. But will that be a good enough safety net, though, considering the season he's been having? Or will they just decide to ride the hot goalie in Husso? Another thing to note for Husso is that he's never been viewed as this top goaltending prospect in his career. He's always been viewed as an all-right goalie prospect who may turn into a mediocre at best starter. But it's very interesting to see the kind of breakout season that he's been having this year, especially when a lot of people saw him as more of a backup the last couple of seasons. Furthermore, Tarasenko's been having a career year, and there's been a lot of breakout years for guys like Kyrou, Thomas, and Barbashev. And even guys who have slowed down on production like Ryan O'Reilly, he still has a Selke pedigree, and they have really 3 lines of offense, and 3 lines of defense, and they have 4 lines of offense. So there's really no definitive weaknesses for the Blues. It's just, I guess, they don't have as much top-end talent compared to some of the better teams in the league. And even guys like Logan Brown, Alexei Toropchenko, and Nathan Walker, these are guys with very little experience in the NHL. They've been absolute wagons this year. Nathan Walker, of course, won the Stanley Cup with the Washington Capitals as a kind of extra on the team. He does bring a little bit of playoff experience, but he is a fantastic player, both analytically and in terms of production, since getting the call-up. And Toropchenko and Brown have been very, very good power forwards, providing a physical edge to that Blues team. So it'll be a very interesting series, and it'll be very very cool to see it play out against 2 teams that I guess stylistically are very different. Another note is that the amount of depth that the Blues have isn't to be understated. They've had 8 players on their team who have above 40-point seasons this past year, which is a ridiculous amount for any team. And considering they only have 109 points, which I know historically is a lot, but given the amount of teams that have above the 100-point mark in the playoffs this year, it's not as much, but considering that, I don't think they're a team to be underrated at all.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. So, prediction-wise, I have the Wild in 7. I think that this series, again, could go either way, but I think that the Wild will take this one, largely due to their increased amount of skill up front. They also will have Fleury, and I think Fleury is going to play a huge role. As mentioned, the top end will come through and kind of facilitate an offensive aspect towards the Minnesota Wild attack that they need for the playoffs. I think guys like Jordan Greenway and Marcus Foligno will play major roles on offense for the Minnesota Wild. Greenway was terrific in the playoffs last year as well. Dumba, Spurgeon, and Brodin, that's obviously an intimidating defensive group. and just overall a team that, has the drive to compete with, as mentioned previously, the Parise and Suter contracts coming into play next season. I think that, yes, the Blues do have cup experience, and if the series could go longer, that could favor them just being in situations like that in the past. But I think that the Wild just have the edge in this one, and I think they take it in 7 games. Close series, but I think it's going Minnesota's way.
I agree with the 7-game prediction, just not the team. I'm going to say Blues in 7. I think they're going to ride the hot goalie. They still have a lot of remnants from the cup-winning team just 3 years ago, and like I said, they have 4 lines and 3 pairs of very strong depth. They are very unassuming, but they play playoff-style hockey under Craig Berube and have all the things you look for in a team that goes far. So I'm going to say Blues in 7.
Awesome. So moving on to the next series, we got 2 more. How we doing? Good?
Yeah.
Awesome. We got the Flames and we've got the Stars. Calgary coming in, one of the best seasons they've had in a long time. Calgary had a 50-win season, 21 losses, 11 overtime and shootout losses, 111 total points on the year for Calgary. The leaders in points, first is Johnny Gaudreau. He had a 40-goal season with 75 assists, a total of 115 points for Johnny Gaudreau. Terrific season for him. Second is Matthew Tkachuk, 42 goals, 62 assists, that is 104 points. An equally terrific season for Tkachuk. And third is Elias Lindholm, 42 goals as well, 40 assists, and 82 total points on the year for Lindholm. The wins leader for the Calgary Flames, of course, Jacob Markstrom, 37 wins on the season. He's going to be their guy in the playoffs as well. And their last playoff appearance came in 2020 as well. They defeated the Winnipeg Jets in 4 games in the play-in round and then lost in the first round to the Dallas Stars, a Stars team that was on its way to the Stanley Cup final. They lost that series in 6 games. Very, very strong Calgary Flames team. They've got a couple Cup champions on their roster, a Cup-winning coach as well, coach that led them to the finals in 2004. Just a very, very well-built roster with an expectation to go long in these Stanley Cup playoffs.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a team, like, as was already mentioned, Gaudreau's having a fantastic year. They don't call him Johnny Hockey for nothing. Tkachuk has been really underrated this past season, and even Elias Lindholm having a 40-goal season. Like, these aren't just their top guys performing; these are their top guys overperforming. They've worked very well under Daryl Sutter, a coach that obviously knows playoff hockey like the back of his hand. He's coached the Kings to 2 cups. He also led the Flames to the finals in 2004, as you said. This is the best top-end talent this team has seen in a long time, maybe since the Iginla era. And not just that, not just top-end talent. They have fantastic forward depth. They brought in guys like Calle Armstrong from Seattle, who happens to be cousins with Elias Lindholm. He's been all right, although I think he's going to turn it up a notch in the playoffs. And they have a lot of physicality on their team. Guys like Eric Branson, who's had 19 points this year, which is a career year. I don't know how, but good on him. It's interesting to see a guy who's struggled his entire career to really be an impactful player at an NHL level, despite being such a high draft pick, really, come into his own at 29. But he's been great. They, of course, have Milan Lucic, who scored above 10 goals, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but as a fourth-line guy, playing Daryl Sutter's hockey, Daryl Sutter's hockey, which is also Milan Lucic's hockey. It's very, very, very good for the team. And this is a team that, again, is built to go far. And it's with the coaching, with the right coaching, and performances from their top-end talent, I could definitely see it happening.
Definitely so. I think that Markstrom is a big outlier for the Flames. If he can bring what he has brought to them, and, we've seen a substantial amount. He was also terrific with the Vancouver Canucks at certain points with his career with Vancouver. So, if he can bring what he's able to, and show in the playoffs that he's able to kind of carry a team like the Flames to a long run, there's nothing in the way of the Flames in making what could be a very historic run for this franchise. And, I think it rides off of him, and then the defense as well you spoke about, and obviously the forward depth and the talent up top as well to kind of make this a run that could be special for the Calgary Flames. On the other side of it, it's the Dallas Stars. The Stars come into the playoffs with a 46-30-6 record, 98 points on the year. Joe Pavelski leads the way in points. He had 27 goals, 54 assists, and 81 points for the former San Jose Shark. Jason Robertson, 41 goals with 38 assists and 79 points on the year. And Roope Hintz coming in third, 37 goals, 35 assists, 72 points for Hintz. And then after that, it's a massive drop-off. And in net, it's Jake Ottinger, 30 wins on the year. He had the most for the Dallas Stars. Last year last playoff appearance, I should say, back in 2020, of course, when they lost to Tampa in the Stanley Cup Final. They defeated these Calgary Flames in 6 games. Then they defeated the Colorado Avalanche in 7, a terrific series there. Then took care of the Vegas Golden Knights in 5 games before losing in 6 to Tampa in the Stanley Cup Final. Good veteran team here in Dallas. A lot of solid pieces, but they're going to need some guys to produce if they want to have a chance in this series.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, after Pavelski, after Robertson and Hintz, it really does drop off hard. A lot of the guys who have been associated with Dallas for the last couple of years, Ben, Seguin, and Radulov, have really been underperforming, with Ben and Seguin hitting just about 40 points and Radulov just about 20. They really need to produce if they want a single shot at this. If they wanted to pull off the upset, Ottinger needs to steal games. I mean, he's done it this past year. There's a reason why he's playing above Braden Holtby, a guy with pedigree and a guy who's historically been a starting goaltender. But will it be enough? I don't know if he's been hot enough. And if, let's say, for example, he isn't able to steal games and the series isn't going their way, could Holtby come in relief and potentially swing the series the other way? He does have that cup-winning experience from Winnipeg, and he does have solid stats this year. But I don't know if it's enough. And I really think, as much credit as I want to give to the Dallas Stars and their top-end talent, they really have no shot at this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would say the same. And as for predictions, I'm going with the Flames in 4. And I'm sorry to Dallas Stars fans out there, but it's not really going to be close in my mind. Calgary's better in pretty much every aspect. They've got the goalie, they've got the defense, they've got the forwards, they've got the better coach, and the better top-end talent as well. Ottinger, I believe, could potentially steal a game for the Stars, maybe at home if they have home ice advantage. But I really don't think that's going to be the case. I think this Flames team is for real. They could really challenge for a Stanley Cup this year. They should really challenge for a Stanley Cup this year. So I'm just saying the Flames sweep away the Dallas Stars in round number 1.
Look, all I'm saying is that it's going to be spring cleaning for the Flames. It's going to be, if possible, it would be in 3. There are no shootouts in the playoffs to bail you out. So, I mean, hopefully with Bowness allegedly retiring at season's end, a new coach can revitalize that old core for next year. But I just don't see it happening this year under current coaching and with the team that they've built. I do not see it happening whatsoever. And I feel bad for guys like Jamie Benn, Alex Radulov, and Tyler Seguin, and Ryan Suter especially, because these are guys who maybe are on their last legs, and could be retiring in the next couple seasons. And, they're starting to see their playoff hopes slip away. So it's hopefully next year, under a new coach, they could kind of bounce back and maybe be a better team suited for the playoffs, but this year is just not the year.
No, definitely I agree. On to the next one. We've got the Edmonton Oilers and the Los Angeles Kings, that is. And for the Edmonton Oilers, obviously a very interesting season and a lot of different storylines coming into it as well. 49 wins for the Oilers on the year, 27 losses, 6 overtime and shootout losses. Total of 104 points for Edmonton on the season. The leader in points, of course, is Connor McDavid, 44 goals, 79 assists, 123 points for the captain, Connor McDavid. Leon Draisaitl in second, 55 goals, 55 assists, 110 points, that is, for Leon Draisaitl. And then third is Zach Hyman, but it drops off quite considerably, to say the least. 27 goals, 27 assists for 54 points in comparison to the 110 for Draisaitl in second. Hyman has 54 in third, so a substantial drop there, of course. In scoring for the Edmonton Oilers. The wins leader for Edmonton, Mikko Koskinen, had 27 on the year. He, of course, also split time with Mike Smith, both of whom were injured, and Smith was injured earlier on in the year as well, so Koskinen wins in that category. Their last playoff appearance came last year, in which they got swept aside by the Winnipeg Jets in the first round, so we'll see if they can bounce back and win a game this time against a Los Angeles Kings squad that's back in the playoffs for the first time in a long while. A lot of interesting storylines going into this series for the Edmonton Oilers, Jake, and we'll see if McDavid and Draisaitl can come in and kind of have the impact on a game that we know that they can, that everyone knows that they can, and Mike Smith's been terrific as of late, so can he continue that going into this playoff series? All's up in the air, but a very interesting storyline are the Edmonton Oilers going into these playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Mike Smith is hot, 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 hot.
Yes.
And, I mean, yes, you know, he started the season very, very cold and wasn't playing his best hockey. He has previously, in a galaxy far away, carried the Yotes to a conference finals.
Yeah.
And so he does have that playoff experience, and it sounds like he's going to be the starter with the little run he's had since his 40th birthday. And as we know, McDavid and Draisaitl are without a doubt game changers. There isn't much debate that these guys are probably first and second best players in the league. And if you don't agree with that, then you at least agree that this is the top duo in the league on any team. So these guys are, I mean, they're just fantastic. Draisaitl is the perfect player to play with McDavid, and McDavid is the perfect player to play with Draisaitl. They coexist perfectly. This is just a fantastic team. Obviously, as you mentioned, 54 points for Zach Hyman. The depth is concerning, to say the least. But, you know, as we know, they have been slowly building that depth with a lot of younger guys like Kyler Yamamoto and Jesse Puljujärvi. But the biggest question mark is the Oilers' defense. Because allegedly, Darnell Nurse has been battling with an injury, and there was some suspicion that he might miss the first round, albeit it does sound like things are moving quite smoothly, and he's responded favorably to questions about him potentially playing in Game 1. But if he isn't playing, what could this mean for the Oilers' defense? I mean, CC and Keith have been surprisingly okay despite historically being terrible, and Kulak has been great, but both Bouchard and Barrie are atrocious defensively, despite being offensive weapons. So if Nurse is gone for the series, how could this affect the Oilers, a team that has very little depth, let alone zero depth? I mean, another thing to mention, though, is that the Oilers have been on fire since the Woodcroft hire, the Jay Woodcroft hire. They definitely need the coaching change, and it's done wonders. They were 24-9-3 a couple of days ago since the hire, and they haven't looked back since. So they're definitely an interesting team. Lots of storylines there.
Yeah, definitely so. I think that the Oilers have a lot of potential to kind of make a run if they can catch fire. As mentioned, we spoke about Smith. You said Smith, hot, 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 hot. And if he can ride that ship the whole way, you never know. As Smith, you mentioned, carrying the Yotes to a conference finals way back when in 2012. As for the Los Angeles Kings, a team that he lost to in the conference finals in 2012, they are back in the playoffs for the first time since 2018. They come in with a 44, 27, and 11 record on the year, 99 points for the Kings. Kopitar finished first with 19 goals, 48 assists for a total of 67 points on the season. Adrian Kempe, 35 goals, 19 assists, 54 total points for Kempe. And Phillip Danault, acquired in the offseason from the Montreal Canadiens, that is. 27 goals for Danault, 24 assists, and 51 total points on the year. The wins leader for the Kings is Jonathan Quick at 23. That is the lowest for any goaltender in the playoffs from a starting perspective. But he split a lot of time with Peterson as well, so going to be interesting to see who they go with for the first round of this playoff series, the Kings. And as mentioned, the last playoff appearance came in 2018, the tail end of their kind of cup winning team potentially that they had in 2012 and 2014, or their competitive team, I should say. They got swept away by the Vegas Golden Knights in 4 games. That was a Golden Knights team that was in its first year on its way to the Stanley Cup Finals. A very interesting team here in the Los Angeles Kings, a good mix of depth, a good mix of youth, and just a lot of interesting storylines as well for them going up against this Oilers team in the playoffs in the first round.
Well, I think the first thing to be mentioned, of course, is Dustin Brown announcing his retirement
yes.
at the end of the season. Um, he's been an impactful player even this year, and he's been impactful since at least 2005, maybe even before then. He's previously been a captain for the team, and has historically been a playoff performer. This is a guy who's a real heart and soul character of this team, and the Kings could build around that. Um, Another storyline, of course, as you know, Dano
Yeah.
has previously been not just good in the playoffs, but has been able to shut down Connor
Yes.
McDavid in the regular season as well, and has shut down top-end talent on Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vegas. So Philip Danault, if he really turns that next level with the Kings, he could shut down the Edmonton Oilers and provide an early exit for the team. I don't think goaltending is going to be as much of a concern in the sense of Jonathan Quick being substituted for Cal Peterson, as Cal Peterson, despite historically being viewed as the replacement for Quick, Quick is having a bit of a bounce back season, despite giving up a few softies here and there. But Cal Peterson has been quite poor this year, to say the least.
Yes.
There is a lot of youth on the team, but none of them have really been great yet. Besides Sean Durzi, I will say Sean Durzi, since being given a extended role on the power play, and I believe he's playing first line minutes with Doughty.
Yeah.
He's been absolutely fantastic, and he has replaced Matt Roy in a few senses, as Matt Roy was originally that player on the team, but since he's been injured, it's been given to Durzi. So it'll be interesting to see if Matt Roy does actually come back during the playoffs, how he'll fit into the roster. But Sean Durzi has been exceptional in a top-end role. So it'll be very neat to see how this team will do. But the series can, in a way, go either way.
Yep, I definitely agree. I think it's going to go to 6, and I think the Oilers are taking it in 6 games. I think that they'll rectify the playoff demons that they faced in last year's playoffs. I think McDavid and Draisaitl show up in a large way. I think that Smith also continues to play like he has, and he carries that playoff experience that he has into this series, making Ken Holland look like, as I think you spoke a couple days ago, a vacuum salesman. A good vacuum salesman, and saying that he doesn't have to go get a goaltender at the deadline, something that a lot of people, including I think both of us, spoke about him maybe needing to do. He did not, and we shall see. I think the defense holds up against the Los Angeles Kings, maybe different in later rounds, but against the Los Angeles Kings, I think that Nurse will play, and I think that because of that, it kind of trickles down, and the defense will hold up. As I mentioned, I don't think it's necessarily a fit in the long run. I think that it could come back to hurt them in the next couple of rounds, or the next round as well. But I do think that the Oilers get by the Kings in 6 games. A young Kings team, maybe not at the same level as they could be in the future. I say Oilers win this one in 6 games.
I'm going to agree with the Oilers prediction, but I'm going to say in 7. I like the team that the Kings have built. They've got a lot of young depth, and of course a lot of good prospects. But I just don't think most of them are ready to make those impactful strides at the NHL level. Let alone in the playoffs, to support this aging core. I do have some concerns with Quick letting in a few softies and being inconsistent. Matched with the poor play from Peterson, I think it's a bit risky to say that the Kings have a legit chance. But I do think that they could definitely extend out the series and make the Oilers play for it.
I definitely agree. We shall see, as that recaps the entirety of the first round playoff matchups, and I think we have a couple more things on the ledger to discuss as we kind of close this one up. Leafs lineups announced earlier today, as they're going to try to take Game 1 at home against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Their lineups were announced, and Jake, just your kind of predictions on thoughts on what they kind of look like going into round 1.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So apparently Bunting and Sandin are battling an injury, hence the reason why that they're considered extras. But it looks like they're rolling with Alex Kerfoot on the first line with Matthews and Marner. Second line of Mikheyev, Tavares, and Kasha. Kasha, who is, of course, back from injury. He's been a very solid player in terms of being kind of that spark plug, which could be very important in the playoffs, but with, of course, injury history and the inconsistent defense, it could be a little concerning. So I'm kind of 50-50 on that. But Mikheyev, of course, has been fantastic this year, especially shorthanded. I think he has like 6 or 7 shorthanded goals this year. He's been ridiculous. The third line, though, Nylander, Kampf, and Engvall, is definitely a bit of a surprise. And then the fourth line of Kyle Clifford, Colin Blackwell, and Simmons, with the notable scratch of Spezza.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be interesting to see what the Leafs kind of do. I think I mentioned when we were talking about them a little bit earlier, just their look is very different than it was from last year going into the playoffs. They're facing a much more intimidating opponent than they were last season. Couldn't get the job done. I think there are concerns. It's gonna be interesting to see what the Leafs can do, and especially, of course, if Bunting can make an impactful return as he has done in the season so far. One kind of wrap up, unless you want to add on with anything.
Yeah, it also looks like defensively they've got the Riley-Lyubushkin pairing.
Yes.
So hopefully Lyubushkin will mitigate the defensive inconsistencies from Riley. And then they've got Muzzin and Brody as the second pair, with Giordano and Liljegren as the third. Of course, Sandin being injured and Hull as the healthy scratch.
Awesome. Well, one thing to kind of wrap up, I think it's important we do this, is the discussion on Guy Lafleur. He obviously passed away earlier this week. A major ovation in Montreal that he received. It was clocked in at 10 minutes and 10 seconds, which of course is fitting for number 10. And personally, I have a story about Guy Lafleur. I met him at a charity event once. I believe this was in 2015, right before the Canadiens went on the playoff run against the Ottawa Senators and then losing to the Tampa Bay Lightning in the second round. I met Guy Lafleur at a charity event, and I spoke to him about the goal that he tied the game on, and just kind of speaking to him about what it meant to play at the Forum. And he said it was terrific, the crowd was terrific, the ambiance was great. Just he seemed like a very, very down to earth kind of guy who was easy to talk to, and someone that just fit the mold of being a star in Montreal very well, which is very, very difficult to do. And especially at a time like the 70s, he obviously had certain difficulties with management later on in his time in Montreal, but being a star, filling the shoes of a guy like Jean Beliveau, it was, a difficult thing for him to do, and he was able to do it after a few difficult seasons and just kind of take off and be a star in a city where, if you're a hockey star, it's quite large. You're quite well known in the city, to say the least. So, rest in peace to a legend in for the Montreal Canadiens, and a guy who will for sure be remembered forever as a hockey legend in the 70s and throughout. So, yeah.
I mean, I personally haven't met Guy Lafleur, but just judging by the absolute outcry of all these different people and their stories from meeting him, and I know he lived just right across the pond near Gatineau, and so I realistically could have met him at some point. It did seem like he was such a nice individual, not just as a hockey player, but also as just a person. It seemed like he really composed himself in the way that, I guess you'd say people, when you think of, I guess, like a hockey player as like when you're younger, you think of them as very, I guess, not just stoic, but also good people, good like team players. And while not everybody fits that mold, of course, you realize that as you're older. Guy Lafleur embodied the kind of caricature I thought of a hockey player when I was younger. He composed himself very well, and was always nice, not just to his family and friends, but also to every fan that ever met him. So, rest in peace.
Definitely so. And that wraps things up here for today's podcast. We recapped, of course, round 1 of the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, and I think both of us are dying to kind of see what goes on in this first round, see the storylines that come out of it, and then, of course, afterwards we will do a recap and then a preview for round number 2 that will be coming up in our next podcast. I'm Jackson Starr. In Ottawa, it's Jake Titus. Thank you for listening so much to the J&J Podcast, the first episode of this podcast. Have a great day, everyone. Good? Done? Okay, I'll stop recording.